Hi, this is Ed Breniger, Circle of Impact Leadership. I've just returned from my 5-week trip to Africa, and this is the third and final report that I want to make on my trip there. It was a fascinating experience, and I would recommend you go to Africa. I would also recommend that you try not to go representing a Western institution of any sort. Instead, that you should go as an individual seeking to understand the people, the communities, the nations of Africa. I was there, and only twice was I ever with Westerners, and that was at a missions conference that the Presbyterian Church of East Africa held in Mombasa, and I was there for 3 days. And then later, at the very end of my trip, I was at the 50th celebration of the start of a church in Benin, West Africa, and there were some Western people from different mission agencies and churches in America and in Europe that were there. The rest of the time I was with Africans. And in many of those places, I was the first white person that many of those people had ever been around. And the commonality of the things that we value was very, very clear to me. Some of the children didn't understand who this white-haired old man was, but many of the children wanted to come and embrace me and to play with me, and it was a lot of fun. And I can imagine what it's like for an African to come to the United States and being in a very much an all-white culture in many respects, and having to deal with that difference. My host and the people that I were with practice what I would say is one of the supreme values of the African continent, which is that of making people feel welcome. And their welcomeness to me is something I will treasure forever. And I'm grateful to them. And it is, in many respects, why I will keep going back to Africa, because they welcome me to come into their fellowship, and they are grateful for what I can come to contribute. But even more so, they are grateful for the opportunity to share their lives and to share their culture with me. And that's a beautiful thing. And I'm not sure that everybody that has ever been to Africa has ever had that sort of relationship with the people, because they tend to go with for institutional purposes. A group will gather together, say from a mission or from a church, and they'll go to do a certain work there. And it's that sense of, we're coming to do something for you. I think in many respects, I went with the opposite expectation of, I don't know what I'm supposed to give to you or offer to you. And let us build a relationship first, and then we can see how I can help you and how you can help me. And one of the ways that happened was I met a young man back in December, and he is a friend of a friend of a friend, and that's how we were connected. And then he connected me with another fellow from Nairobi who is a leadership expert. He's a leadership guy. He teaches leadership. He's working on his PhD in leadership and governance. And we met on the first day that I was in Kenya in late January. First day I was there. And he asked me, would you be interested in doing some speaking while you're here? I said, sure, why not? Yes, I'd be glad to. It wasn't what I thought was going to happen. And so his name is Paul, and Paul went to work to establish, as it turned out, 7 different events for me where I spoke to a wide spectrum of people, from millennials, business people, to academics, and who all teach leadership in different universities in Nairobi, to students at 2 different other universities, to a business ethics network that meets for breakfast, and then to one of the largest international banks there in Nairobi. And he set all that up, and and it was a really fun experience because 6 of those events took place in a 2-day span, three events each day. And you would think that would be an exhausting sort of experience, but it wasn't. It was totally invigorating, because what I found were people who were hungry to learn about leadership, and they were hungry to learn about leadership in a different way than they see it as it's presented to them in all the various forms that come at them from the Western world. And so there is an opportunity for me to return to do training and to speak more and to coach some of these folks to see how they can develop their skills to be men and women who are making a difference that matters in their city. And that is true for what happened in Nairobi. And then I go to Uganda and then on to Benin, where I'm primarily working with two churches. And one is a small church down near Lake Victoria, south of Kampala. And these are not people who are who come to their experience of leadership from an academic or theoretical point of view. They come at it from a very practical point of view of how do I live and how do I make sense of the world that surrounds me. And so the language of leadership changes when you move out of a kind of a business institutional setting and more into a life lived on the street setting. One of the young women that I spoke to one evening, I talked to her a little bit about what being a person of impact was and how she could do that. And I asked her, does any of this make sense to you? And she said, no. And I asked some more questions. And in asking the questions, I realized that no one had ever mentored her. No one had ever taken her at any point during her childhood into her 20s and talked to her about who she was and how she could make a difference in the world. And so we had that conversation, and I simply put that conversation into the context of the hotel where she works, which is where I was staying. And almost immediately I could see a transformation in her own self-perception, that she saw herself as someone who could do things. And there were other situations like that where speaking to a group of people, and in every one of these situations, when you come from a different world, a different culture, but you're also bringing a different message than what they're used to hearing from that culture, it takes a little bit for them to adjust to, oh, this person's not saying what we've already heard before. This person's saying something different, and we need to lean in more and listen to what he has to say. And the response from some of these people, some of them are pastors of churches, was very gratifying, because I think what they saw was, here's a pathway where our people can become people who are making a greater difference in our community and through our church, because now they're developing the skills that they need to make a difference in their families and in their communities. And these are not people who are coming into this environment with a lot of wealth. They're coming from very poor, impoverished backgrounds, and yet at the same time, they have the opportunity to do things which can make a difference in their world. And that was true for almost every place that I went, where some of the people I met were people coming from impoverished environments. I think the last thing I want to speak to is in the previous video and newsletter, I posted videos of 3 women that I interviewed outside of Turbo, Kenya. And these women are being trained to be farmers. They have their own little farm, and it begins with 1 chicken. And you can if you go to my YouTube channel, just look for Ed Breniger, you'll find these 3 videos where I've interviewed the two women, the three women, and then the third video where I interview their teacher. And what I was impressed by was that there was no mindset of victimhood by these women, that they wanted to do things, they wanted to learn things so that they could take charge of their families, and so they would start with a chicken, and they would have eggs to sell, and they would have laying hens that they could sell, and they would sell those when they would need, say, their school fees, and that's a really big deal, is paying for the school fees, because education is a pathway forward and upward for these impoverished families. And then they learn how to grow crops. They go vegetables, and they learn how to handle a cow, and they learn how to plant trees and to grow things. And these are primarily women who are either single or widowed. And I was so taken by their mindset that says we're going to have the discipline to do the things that we need to do, and we're going to do this so that we won't be idle, and we won't let crime come into our families, and we can pay our school fees, and we will have money so that when we get older and we're too old to work our little plot of land, that we'll have some money that we can live on when we are retired. And here are these impoverished people having a plan for their life that comes from being trained how to begin a farm with one chicken. And I think that's probably the thing which has stayed with me more than anything else, is to see that there is an answer to the issues, the social issues that we all face here in the United States. But the problem is that here in the United States, we set up all these obstacles for people to be self-sufficient, and in a community to be interdependent. And yet this is the goal for these women, is to be self-sufficient and interdependent with their neighbors, so that they can support one another and they can live a life outside of poverty and outside of crime and outside of idleness that they see is the pathway to a sad life. So I'm going back to Africa, and I'm going back on a regular basis. And while I was there on this trip, if you've read my book, you know that my goal has been to move 1% of the world's population to take personal initiative to ignite change. Well, after meeting with these women and meeting with these young men in Nairobi, and meeting with these pastors in Uganda and in Benin, I left with the belief that my 1% goal is too small. And so I have decided to 10x my goal and shoot for 10% of the world's population becoming persons of impact for their local communities. So now we're talking about 750 million people. And I believe that it is very possible. And it will start in Africa. And I think then it will grow from Africa, east and west, and north and south. Well, actually, not south, but north and east and west, around the globe, because what they have learned is how to take care of themselves. But the other thing is that they have a culture which allows for the interdependency to work as a network of relationships. So as the circle of impact model is shared across the world, and the two global forces becomes an image that we can look and see how these centralized institutions are failing because they, one, are not quickly adaptable to the changes that we're seeing, coronavirus being a prime example of this, and seeing how the presence of networks of relationships grow, and that they are quite agile, and they are representative of another idea that now I have framed in this way. This is the last thing I'm saying. It is clear to me that we're at a point in time where we have to change the way we structure organizations. And so we now, and this is a quote, this is now time for us to restructure through leadership capacity building. And we build leadership capacities from the ground up, from the lowest echelon of a company or a community. We build it up, and it bubbles up through the system, and then it provides the foundation for the kinds of changes that need to happen up in the upper echelons of every organization and in every nation. And if you were with me during these 5 weeks, you would have heard a constant discussion about what do we do about the corruption that we see in our countries. And it's the same kind of corruption that we see here in the West. And so I say to them, corruption is a sign, it's a signal of the end of a era of a type of organization that is no longer functioning according to its original purpose. And as it fails, another type of structure is going to ascend. And that, to me, is what I call a network of relationships. This is what I'm going to be writing on and talking on, and this is what I'm going to be discovering how to articulate to the West by training people in Africa and how to be networks of relationship people in their communities and in their companies. And that is going to be why I believe that Africa will be the leaders of the future, because they are already taking the steps to change in a way that most of us are not doing everywhere else in the world. So thank you. And if this is the first time you've seen one of my newsletters, thank you. I hope you will stay with it. This is a little longer video than normal, but I needed to say some things to you so that you understand that what is transpiring is not recreational or simply for my own just enjoyment. That I see that there is a mission here to build leadership in Africa that then can extend throughout the rest of the world. So I thank you for your support, and I welcome your comments and I welcome your interaction with me, and I look forward to seeing you when I can down the road. Thank you very much.